2 words: General William Westmoreland, commanding every American soldier in Vietnam, presiding over a 500,000 strong army, and a budget that exceeded the GDP of most countries on Earth, flew into Nui Dat, base in Phuoc Tuy Province in January 1967, looked at how the 1st Australian Task Force operated, and said those 2 words: very inactive. He stood in the operations tent, studying a map covered in patrol routes that Australian soldiers walked at a pace of roughly 1 kilometre per hour through triple canopy jungle, and what he saw in those routes was laziness. He saw cowardice. He saw men who didn't want to fight. Behind him hung the sortie board for his helicopter fleet, thousands of flights per month. In front of him, a map of people who walked. Then Westmoreland flew back to Saigon and formally complained to Major General Douglas Tim Vincent, Commander Australian Force Vietnam, that one ATF was not being aggressive enough. That wasn't a suggestion. That was pressure from the theatre commander on a subordinate national contingent. Change how you fight. Fight like us. And in his memoir, A Soldier Reports, the same Westmoreland would write that the Australians were the most thoroughly professional foreign force serving in Vietnam, comparing them to the post-Versailles German army, in which even men in the ranks might have been leaders in some less capable force. The most professional, and simultaneously, very inactive. The man praised the result while rejecting the method that produced it. 4 years after that visit, Australian intelligence would record that Viet Cong food supplies in Phuoc Tuy Province had dropped from 1,250 kilograms per bunker to 20. The insurgency in the province starved, not from B-52 carpet bombing, not from helicopter raids, from those same, very inactive patrols that had so irritated Westmoreland. And Westmoreland himself would be quietly recalled from Vietnam by then. In June 1968, he'd leave for Washington, promoted to Army Chief of Staff. Officially, an advancement. In reality, a soft removal. His search and destroy strategy was already visibly unraveling. The Tet Offensive of January 1968, which Westmoreland had declared impossible a week before it began, destroyed whatever remained of confidence in his assessments. The man who'd complained about someone else's inactivity had failed to predict the largest enemy operation of the entire war, but that comes later. First, 2 armies, 2 doctrines, and 1 jungle. And a question nobody at the Pentagon wanted to answer: what if the quiet ones were right? To understand why Americans and Australians fought 2 completely different wars within a few dozen kilometers of each other, you need to rewind about 20 years. Because the problem didn't start in Vietnam, it started in training centers, in field manuals, in how each of these 2 armies answered one question: what is war? The American Army by 1965 was a machine built for World War III. Soviet tanks through the Fulda Gap into West Germany. That's what it was designed for. Massed firepower, vertical envelopment by helicopter, fire support at every level from platoon to division. When that machine was dropped into the jungles of Southeast Asia, it brought its logic with it: search and destroy, battalion and above helicopter-borne sweeps, artillery preparation, B-52 strikes, the so-called arc-light missions, where a trio of strategic bombers turned a square kilometer of jungle into a moonscape, and the metric of success: body count. How many dead bodies? Kill enough and the insurgency collapses. Simple logic, industrial logic, and utterly wrong for the war being fought on the ground. But more on that later. The Australian Army came to Vietnam with different baggage. 12 years of the Malayan Emergency, 1948 to 1960. 3 years of the Borneo Confrontation, 1963 to 1966. These were wars against guerrillas in jungle. Not theoretical, fought, won, paid for in blood and sweat. And those wars produced a doctrine codified in Australia's pamphlet number 11, Counter-Revolutionary Warfare, published in 1965, built directly on the British Atom pamphlet, The Conduct of Anti-Terrorist Operations in Malaya. Remember that pamphlet. It will become the subject of mockery, institutional friction, and, 3 decades later, copying. In Malaya, Australians learned lessons that no classroom can teach, that you won't find a guerrilla by crashing a battalion through the jungle, he'll simply leave, that a helicopter is audible for kilometers, and by the time you've landed, the enemy is in the next province. That the only way to control jungle is to live in it. For weeks, for months, moving so slowly and so quietly that the forest begins to treat you as its own. Major General Walter Walker, commanding operations in Borneo, codified 6 principles: unified operations, effective intelligence, speed and flexibility, base security, winning hearts and minds. And the 6th, domination of the jungle, not territorial control in the staff officer sense. Domination. Live in the jungle, breathe the jungle, become the jungle, and when the enemy enters your jungle, he enters your home. Major Harry Smith, whose D Company of 6 RAR would fight the Battle of Long Tan, trained his men on exactly these principles because he'd served as a platoon commander in Malaya himself. The SASR, Special Air Service Regiment, had first seen active service in Borneo, conducting secret cross-border claret operations into Indonesian territory. They didn't learn jungle warfare from a book, they wrote the book. And here's what happened in May 1962 at the ANZUS meeting in Canberra. US Secretary of State Dean Rusk, according to diplomatic sources, openly admitted that American armed forces knew little about jungle warfare. Openly, at an official meeting, he knew who did know, and he asked for help. Remember that request. It matters for what comes next. The Jungle Training Centre at Canungra, Queensland, the one Serong had commanded, was the place through which every Australian soldier bound for Vietnam physically passed. A 9-week course in conditions as close to tropical hell as the Australian bush could produce. Patrolling in rain, ambushes at night, tracking, navigation without maps. An Australian arriving in South Vietnam already knew the smell of rotting leaf litter and the sound of bamboo cracking under a boot 300 meters away. He'd trained on those smells and sounds at Canungra. An American conscript arrived in Vietnam after 8 weeks of basic training and 8 weeks of advanced, on ranges designed for Europe. He was taught to shoot, march, and follow orders. He was not taught to listen to the jungle, not because his commanders were stupid, because their doctrine didn't consider it necessary. Why listen to the jungle when you can call in an airstrike? What did an Australian patrol in Phuoc Tuy actually look like? Not in the manuals, on the ground? Journalist Gerald Stone spent time with Australian patrols in 1966 and reported that patrols have taken as much as 9 hours to sweep a mile of terrain. They move forward a few steps at a time, stop, listen, then proceed again. 9 hours to cover a mile and a half. An American infantryman used to helicopter insertions and sweeping clearance operations would have looked at this and concluded the Australians were broken. But there was a system inside that slowness, a ruthless, honed, hard-earned system. The average Australian infantryman spent over 250 days on patrol during his 12-month deployment. Think about that. 250 out of 365 days in the jungle. Individual operations lasted 3 to 4 weeks of continuous foot patrolling and night ambushing. Companies and platoons operated semi-independently, pushing deep into jungle for weeks with weekly helicopter resupply. They avoided tracks and clearings because a track means a mine, picking through bamboo and undergrowth through vines thick as a forearm, through humidity so dense that sweat ate through the stitching of their clothes. Here's what that meant tactically. More than half of all Australian ambushes were sprung at 15 meters or less. 15. That's the distance from you to the far wall of a room. Nearly 80% of all contacts occurred within 30 meters. At that range, you don't fire in the direction of the enemy. You fire at a specific person. You see his face. The SASR operated even harder. 4 to 5 man teams, radio silence, 12 hours or more. When American liaison officers learned about this, they froze. We have men in the field, and we can't contact them for 12 hours? How is that possible? Like this. Because any radio signal is a beacon for direction finding. Because the click of a transmit switch is a sound that carries dozens of meters in jungle silence. Because silence is a weapon, the cheapest and most effective weapon there is. Historian Albert Palazzo put it precisely. the Australian Army entered Vietnam with its own well-considered concept of war. One, often contradictory or in conflict with US concepts. Contradictory is putting it mildly. It was their complete inversion. Americans entered the area of operations by helicopter. UH-1 Hueys, audible from 5 kilometers, opened fire with everything that could shoot, swept the area and flew out. Australians crawled in on foot silently on their stomachs and stayed for weeks, turning themselves into part of the soil, the roots, the decaying leaf litter. One army waged a war of invasion, the other a war of presence. One more detail that's lost on anyone who hasn't been in the jungle. Noise? An American operation is noise, the roar of turbines, the crack of rotors, shouted commands during insertion, the clatter of equipment, boots on a trail, radio traffic every 15 minutes, radio traffic that the enemy intercepted with basic Chinese-supplied equipment. An Australian patrol is silence, a specific, disciplined silence that takes training to achieve. Every piece of equipment secured, so nothing rattles, clinks, or creaks. Before stepping off, each soldier jumps on the spot while the group listens. If something jangles, strap it again. Movement on the balls of the feet, shifting weight to the front foot before placing the rear. Communication by hand signal, a cough, a sneeze, face buried in the crook of the elbow, into fabric, to absorb the sound. No smoking for 24 hours before patrol, because tobacco smell gives away position. No insect repellent, it smells, which means mosquitoes, malarial, Vietnamese, in their thousands. You don't swat them, you endure. That's what lay behind those 9 hours per mile. Not slowness, the discipline of silence. And when those two concepts collided face to face, conflict was inevitable. The first direct clash didn't happen in the jungle, it happened in the headquarters. Colonel Ted Serong, remember this name, was arguably the foremost Australian expert on counterinsurgency of his generation. Former commanding officer of the Jungle Training Centre at Canongra, Queensland. In 1962, he arrived in Vietnam at the direct request of the Americans. Rusk had personally asked Canberra to send Serong. He was appointed senior advisor on counterinsurgency to the commander of MACV, serving under both General Harkins and General Westmoreland. By September 1962, Serong had concluded that MACV's reports of progress were, in his words, wildly optimistic. He worked that out in 6 months. American generals never worked it out in 10 years. In May 1963, Serong expressed doubt about the Strategic Hamlet program at a US counterinsurgency group meeting in Washington. This drew, I'm quoting the research, a violent challenge from US Marine General Victor Brute Krulak. Nickname Brute, 5'4", but a man colonels feared and generals listened to. And this man tore into Serong for daring to speak the truth out loud. Serong was right. The Strategic Hamlet program collapsed within months. Peasants were being herded into fortified settlements, torn from their land, from their ancestors' graves, from the rice paddies that had fed their families for generations. The Viet Cong didn't storm the hamlets. They simply waited for the inhabitants to scatter on their own. By the time Diem fell in November 1963, the program existed only on paper and in Pentagon briefings, where charts still showed growing numbers of pacified villages. But being right didn't win Serong any popularity at the Pentagon. Being right at the Pentagon rarely does. It wins you violent challenges. And then came Ewell. Lieutenant General Julian Ewell commanded 2nd Field Force Vietnam, the Corps-level headquarters to which 1ATF reported from April 1969 to April 1970. His nickname was the Butcher of the Delta. During Operation Speedy Express, his 9th Infantry Division claimed 10,889 enemy killed. How many weapons were recovered? Fewer than 750, 10,000 dead, and 700 weapons. A ratio that screams one thing: massive civilian casualties. The US Army Inspector General later estimated between 5,000 and 7,000 civilian casualties during that single operation, 5,000 civilians, for statistics. And this man began pressuring Australian commanders to increase their body count totals. That's documented in Ashley Eakins' official history, Fighting to the Finish. Ewell wanted the Australians to count corpses the way he did, count them and report them, send in numbers, big numbers, pretty numbers for Washington. Australian battalion commanders, according to historians, held the body count metric in contempt. Not just disagreed, held it in contempt, because they knew from Malaya and Borneo what that metric does to an army. It turns the count into the objective, and when the count becomes the objective, you start counting the wrong people. Historian Andrew Ross captured the bigger picture. The US Higher Command never fully understood the counter-revolutionary doctrine of the Australians and New Zealanders and tended to characterize 1ATF's low-intensity operations as pussyfooting or avoiding the enemy, cowardice, softness, unwillingness to fight. That's what it looked like from a helicopter. From the ground, it looked entirely different. From the ground, it was 80% first fire contacts, a 7-to-1 exchange ratio, and a province where the guerrillas were starving. Ross, Hall and Griffin in their Cambridge University press study confirmed it. Australian and British counterinsurgency experience was dismissed as irrelevant to Vietnam by senior US generals in favor of the brutal and unsophisticated strategy of attrition. Brutal and unsophisticated, those aren't my words, that's the assessment of professional military historians in a peer-reviewed publication. This is where we need to stop and talk about how we know what we know, because in this story, the quality of the data isn't a technical detail, it's a weapon. The Australian Army maintained a Contact After Action Report System, CAAR. Every contact was documented with a pedantry that bewildered even the Australians themselves. Rounds fired by weapon type, enemy strength assessment, casualty assessment, contact circumstances, verification up the chain of command. The Australian Army Operational Research Group, AAORG, analysed this data contemporaneously, producing studies like AAORG Memo M38, Analysis of Australian Army Contacts in South Vietnam during 1967 to 1969, dated March 1970. That data infrastructure enabled the most comprehensive quantitative study of the war. Ross, Hall and Griffin in The Search for Tactical Success in Vietnam, Cambridge University Press, 2015, analysed over 4,100 contacts from the Vietnam Combat Database held at the Australian War Memorial. 4,100. That's not opinion, that's a dataset. Now the numbers. Hold them in your head because they explain everything. The 1st Australian Task Force recorded at least 3,370 enemy killed between June 1966 and December 1971. Total Australian Army losses, 478 killed in action across the entire war. The recorded exchange ratio, approximately 7-to-1. Approximately, because kill ratios in Vietnam were an unstable metric, and honesty demands that caveat. The Australians were more honest than most in their counting, but even their data comes from field reports, not from absolute truth. But here's where it gets specific. When one ATF gained the first burst of fire in a contact, meaning they opened fire first, the exchange ratio jumped to 10-to-1. 10. Every Australian killed in such a contact took 10 of the enemy with him, and one ATF gained that first burst in approximately 80% of all contacts. 4 out of 5 times, the Australians fired first. 4 out of 5 times, the enemy didn't know they were there until it was too late. 4 out of 5 times, the silence they'd been mocked for became the first volley. That's not luck, and it's not happens in a good week. That's 80% across more than 4,000 contacts. That's a system. The direct product of their patrol doctrine, stealth movement, pre-positioned ambush, disciplined fire control. Ambushes constituted 36% of all 1 ATF contacts. Combined with patrol encounters, 70% of all engagements. Long Tan. August 1966. A rubber plantation 5 kilometers from Nui Dat. Wet season. August 18th, late afternoon. 108 men of D Company, 6 RAR, under Major Harry Smith walked out on a patrol, routine, following a mortar attack on the base the previous night. They were looking for mortar positions. They found something else. Main Force Viet Cong, the 275th VC Regiment. Estimates ranged from 2,000 to 2,500 fighters. D Company found itself facing a force that outnumbered it 20 to 1. Driving rain, visibility, dozens of meters between the rows of rubber trees. 11 platoon made first contact, then 10 platoon. D Company deployed and began holding its position. The difficulties, if that word even applies, were beyond any textbook. Ammunition running low, radio communications cutting in and out, the VC flanking from multiple directions, rain turning the ground to slurry, artillery from Nui Dat supported with fire, 3,198 rounds during the battle, adjusted by Captain Maury Stanley from within the company position. New Zealand gunners of 161 Battery RNZA fired until their barrels glowed. One gun crew kept shooting after the pit flooded knee-deep with rainwater. A RAAF helicopter dropped ammunition directly onto the company position, and some of the crates landed in no man's land. Soldiers crawled out to retrieve them under fire, under rain, through rubber tree milk streaming from punctured trunks. When the APCs of 3rd Cavalry Regiment and A Company, 6 RAR arrived after nearly 4 hours, the field count showed 245 confirmed enemy dead, 18 Australians killed, 24 wounded, recorded exchange ratio 13.6 to 1, against 20 to 1 numerical superiority, and the SASR. The regiment achieved the most extraordinary ratio of the entire war. Approximately 600 enemy killed across 1,200 combat patrols. 1 man killed in action, Private David Fisher. 1 died of wounds. The North Vietnamese gave them a name, Ma Rung, the ghost of the jungle. A former Viet Cong fighter said, and this is documented, "We were not afraid of the American GIS, Australian infantry, or even B-52 bombing. We hated the Australian SAS Rangers because they make comrades disappear." Disappear, not killed in battle, not shot during a sweep. Disappear, walking point and gone, went to fetch water and gone, as though the forest took them, 4 men in a team, 12 hours of silence, and comrades disappearing. Now, ammunition expenditure. Because this is where the difference between the two approaches stops being debatable and becomes arithmetic. The most frequently cited American figure is 50,000 rounds of small arms ammunition per enemy casualty. Some sources put it at 200,000 rounds per person. That's not war. That's the industrial combustion of brass and powder. That's an army firing. Not to hit anything, but to feel like it's doing something. Suppressive fire from long range, fire by grid square, fire at sound, fire just in case. Australian 1 ATF figures were, according to Hall and Ross's peer-reviewed analysis in Defence and Security Analysis 2018, several orders of magnitude lower. Orders of magnitude, not percentages, orders of magnitude. In roughly 22% of all 1 ATF contacts, the result, a confirmed enemy casualty, was achieved with 30 or fewer rounds expended. 30, not 30,000. This reflected not just better marksmanship, though that too, it was the product of a fundamentally different philosophy. Aimed fire at close range rather than suppressive fire from a distance. Ambushes were initiated by claymore mines, directional fragmentation, which turned the first seconds of contact into carnage. And after the claymores, the L1A1SLR, a 7.62mm self-loading rifle, at a range where you could count the buttons on the enemy's shirt, every shot at a specific target. And the operational impact on the province? The 1 ATF captured over 1,800 bunker systems and base camps in Phuoc Tuy during its time there. And the food supply data tells the story of a province being methodically strangled. Not bombed, not burned, strangled. Average food captured per bunker system, 1,250 kilograms in 1966, 47 kilograms in 1970, 20 kilograms in 1971, from 1,250 to 20 in 5 years without a single B-52. By mid-1969, this supply collapse had halted main force enemy movement into the province. Enemy-initiated contacts, in the historian's phrase, collapsed. By June 1971, historian Robert O'Neill assessed only approximately 600 VC/NVA remained in Phuoc Tuy, against 6,000 South Vietnamese territorial forces, and now, that same body count that Ewell had pressured the Australians about. A survey of US officers found 61% believed body counts were often inflated. Comments included a fake, totally worthless, and the immensity of the false reporting is a blot on the honor of the Army. All individuals killed in declared free fire zones were automatically counted as enemy KIA. The informal field rule, if it's dead and Vietnamese, it's VC, was common knowledge. Body counts were tied directly to promotions and commendations, creating incentives that corrupted everything they touched. The Australian system deliberately avoided this, not because Australians were morally superior as a nation, but because their doctrine, the Malayan Doctrine, grew from an understanding: the metric determines the behavior. Give an army the wrong metric and it will fight the wrong war, with complete dedication and in absolutely the wrong direction. Here's the paradox that usually gets missed. The American system, obsessed with counting the dead, generated data it couldn't trust. The Australian system, which despised body counts, generated data that historians trust 50 years later. The 1 ATF-CAAR reports sit in the Australian War Memorial. You can check them, every contact, every shot, every result. Try doing that with American data from 3rd and 4th Corps zones, and you'll find numbers that contradict themselves within a page. Data quality isn't a bureaucratic virtue, it's a strategic resource. An army that lies to itself about results cannot correct its tactics. It's condemned to repeat its mistakes, treating each new one as success. In fairness, Australian doctrine wasn't flawless, and there's one catastrophe that can't be glossed over: Brigadier Stuart Graham's barrier minefield. In 1967, Graham ordered the laying of an 11-kilometre belt of M16 jumping jack anti-personnel mines from Dat Du to the coast, approximately 20,000 to 23,000 mines. The idea was borrowed from Malaya, cut Viet Cong supply lines with a physical barrier. In Malaya, it had worked. But Malaya wasn't Vietnam. In Malaya, the guerrillas lacked broad popular support. In Vietnam, the villages were part of the supply network. The idea was a catastrophe. The VC and local villagers lifted thousands of mines and turned them against the Australians. A captured VC document from May 1969 recorded a resolution to destroy the Australians' fence and remove and collect 1,000 mines. Between 1967 and 1971, 55 1ATF soldiers were killed and approximately 250 wounded by their own mines. That was roughly 10% of all Australian casualties. From May 1969 to May 1970, M16 mine casualties rose to over half of 1ATF's total losses. Half. Historian Greg Lockhart called it the biggest blunder in Australian military history since the Second World War. He was right, and within Australian Command there was no consensus on doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Colin Kahn of 5 RAR complained his unit had been trained for totally the wrong war, called pacification a waste of time, and wanted to hunt main force units. Lieutenant Colonel Keith O'Neill of 8 RAR reached the opposite conclusion, that deep jungle operations created excessive casualties for little permanent gain, and that operations around villages were far more effective. This internal debate mirrored, in miniature, the same fracture tearing the American army apart, but with one difference: the Australian debate was happening inside a system that worked. The results were there, the numbers were there. The argument was about how to become even more effective, not about whether anything worked at all. That distinction matters more than it sounds, and Graham's minefield doesn't refute the doctrine. It refutes one specific tactical decision by one commander who misapplied a Malayan principle to Vietnamese reality. The doctrine of stealthy patrolling, night ambushes, and small unit operations continued to work throughout the entire period of the mine disaster. Mine casualties were horrific, but the province kept tightening around the Viet Cong. Food kept disappearing from bunkers. Enemy-initiated contacts kept falling. The system worked, even with a wound it had inflicted on itself. And now, the part the Pentagon doesn't like to remember. How Mockery became a training syllabus. Because running parallel to the pressure and the criticism was a second process. Quiet, documented, and completely contradicting the official rhetoric. Start with Serong. That same Colonel Krulak had attacked in 1963 for telling the truth about strategic hamlets. After leaving the Australian Army in 1968, Serong prepared strategic analyses for the Rand Corporation and the Hudson Institute. He advised 3 American presidents, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. He briefed the National Security Council in Washington. He gave presentations at Fort Bragg, home of US Special Forces, and his advice on tactics and training methods were duly adopted into counterinsurgency courses. That's a quote, not an interpretation. Serong stayed in Vietnam until the very end, until April 29, 1975, the day Saigon fell. He left on one of the last helicopters out, but the tactical knowledge transfer channel was wider than one man. From 1967, SASR personnel served as instructors at the MACV Recondo School at Nha Trang. That school was established by Westmoreland himself. Yes, that Westmoreland, very inactive, by order in September 1966 to train long-range reconnaissance patrol personnel. An Australian warrant officer from the AATTV, the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, was permanently attached to the school. He assisted with Recondo training and occasionally led American teams on patrols himself, taught them to walk quietly, taught them to stop and listen, taught them not to shoot at shadows. The school graduated over 3,515 personnel from 1966 to 1971. 3,500 Americans trained partly by Australians, returning to their units, carrying Australian tactical DNA in their heads. LRRP historians recorded, some LRRP units copied Australian tactics. Anzac training suggested 3- and 4-man teams, while SF trainers tended to form groups as large as 6, 8, and more. Australian methods regarding silent movement, extended patrolling without resupply, and immediate action drills became embedded in American LRRP standard operating procedures. Think about the chronology. January 1967, Westmoreland calls the Australians very inactive. September 1966, 4 months earlier, the same Westmoreland establishes a school where Australians will teach Americans how to fight. The left hand mocks. The right hand takes notes. That's not a paradox. That's institutional schizophrenia. More broadly, the AATTV operated across all of South Vietnam, embedded within US Special Forces, CIA operations, and MACV advisory teams. The jungle warfare methods they transferred emphasized patrolling and contact drills, which taught soldiers to react automatically in battle. General Crichton Abrams, who replaced Westmoreland as theater commander, personally presented the US Army Meritorious Unit Commendation to the AATTV on September 30th, 1970. And there's one more detail that usually gets lost. The AATTV helped train 14 American combat tracker teams at the British Jungle Warfare School in Johor Bahru, Malaysia. This was kept secret because Britain and Malaysia were officially neutral on Vietnam. Americans secretly traveling to Malaysia to learn from people whose methods they publicly called cowardice. Secretly learning from the people you publicly mock. There's something about that which feels very familiar in large organizations. The direct operational comparison came in 1965 when 1st Battalion RAR was attached to the US 173rd Airborne Brigade at Bien Hoa. This was the test. How did two systems work side by side? The contrast was so stark that both sides agreed. Australian forces should be deployed to a separate province and allowed to fight their own way. Not out of respect, out of impossibility. Two armies couldn't do the same thing because they were doing literally the opposite. The attachment highlighted the differences between Australian and American operational methods so clearly that separation was the only solution. One American officer understood this better than most. Colonel David Hackworth, described by General Abrams as the best battalion commander I ever saw in the United States Army. Hackworth specifically praised Australian methods. The Aussies used squads to make contact and brought in reinforcements to do the killing. They planned in the belief that a platoon on the battlefield could do anything. A platoon could do anything. That's not bravado. That's doctrine. If your platoon has spent 3 weeks in the jungle, knows every trail, has set ambushes, has ranged its markers, then yes, it can do anything, because the jungle has become theirs. Hackworth created Tiger Force for the 101st Airborne Division, a unit designed to out-guerrilla the guerrillas. Tiger Force's reconnaissance patrol concepts paralleled SASR methodology. After his famous 1971 TV interview criticizing the conduct of the war, Hackworth moved to Australia's Gold Coast, lived there for years. The man Abrams considered the best combat commander in America went to live among the people Westmoreland had called very inactive. He knew where the professionals lived. There's a bitter irony in the fact that Hackworth, decorated, combat-proven, uncompromising, found more in common with Australian infantrymen than with his own generals. His Tiger Force tried to adopt the small team principle, but Tiger Force operated inside a system that measured success by body count. The unit degenerated quickly. The Toledo Blade would later investigate war crimes committed by Tiger Force personnel in 1967. You can copy a method, you can't copy a culture. Without the Malayan school, without Kanungra, without 12 years of patient training in real jungle, technique remains technique. It doesn't become doctrine. The command architecture provided constant friction. The 1ATF was operationally under US 2 Field Force Vietnam, but nationally under HQ Australian Force Vietnam in Saigon. The task force commander had to reconcile sometimes inconsistent objectives, tasks set by the American Corps headquarters and directives from his own government. As the Australian Army Research Centre noted, while US commanders were generally content to let the Australians conduct their own war in Phuoc Tuy, on occasion the differences in doctrine and operational style became a source of annoyance. Annoyance, that's what they called it. When your method works better than your boss's method, it annoys the boss, not you. But the deepest influence came after Vietnam, and it came through a book. Lieutenant Colonel John Nagel wrote, "Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife," counterinsurgency lessons from Malaya and Vietnam for his Oxford PhD. His supervisor, Professor Robert O'Neill. The same O'Neill who had served as intelligence officer with 5 RAR in Vietnam, and wrote Vietnam Task, one of the key regimental histories of the war. An Australian veteran who'd fought that war supervised the dissertation that would become the foundation of a new American doctrine. Nagel argued that the British Army succeeded in Malaya where the US Army failed in Vietnam because the British possessed a learning culture, the ability to adapt to reality rather than impose doctrine onto reality. The book became one of the foundational texts for FM 3-24, the US Army/Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual, December 2006, co-authored by General David Petraeus. And here the Australian Land Warfare Studies Centre observed, dryly, with that particular Australian understatement, "From the Australian perspective, it is a pity that Nagel ignored the experience of the only army that fought in both theatres, the Australian Army. The only army that fought in both Malaya and Vietnam, the direct carrier of the experience Nagel described through intermediaries, and that carrier was ignored in his own study. They didn't take offence, just noted the fact, and moved on, very Australian, but there was one person who couldn't be ignored." Dr. David Kilcullen, a retired Australian Army infantry officer, became senior counterinsurgency advisor to General Petraeus in Iraq, principal architect of the Joint Campaign Plan guiding the 2007 surge, special advisor to Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. His paper, 28 Articles, Fundamentals of Counterinsurgency, became Appendix A to FM 3-24. The manual was adopted by the US, Australian, British, Canadian, Dutch, Iraqi, and Afghan armies. Kilcullen received the US Army Superior Civilian Service Medal, the first such award to a foreign national serving in combat, alongside US forces. An Australian officer wrote the American Doctrine. Didn't help, didn't consult. Wrote, the circle closed, but it took 40 years. Between Very Inactive and FM 3-24, an entire generation. Vietnam veterans grew old. Many died. Those who survived watched their grandchildren read manuals built on principles for which their grandfathers had been mocked. Historian Andrew Ross summarized the pattern with surgical precision. Tactical level admiration. Hackworth, the Recondo instructors, LRRP commanders, coexisting with strategic level dismissal. Westmoreland, Ewell, MACV headquarters. The soldier on the ground could see the Australian method worked. The general in the headquarters could see that the Australian method didn't fit his reporting framework. And the general won, until reality defeated the general. Iraq and Afghanistan were that reality. The same mistakes, massive operations, destroyed infrastructure, embittered populations, mounting resistance, and the same lessons, relearned through Nagel, through Kilcullen, through people who read what the Australians had done in 1966 and understood it still worked in 2006, just without the two words, without Very Inactive. January 1967, Westmoreland stands in the operations tent at Nui Dat and says two words, Very Inactive, about men who spend 250 days a year in the jungle, about men who crawl 9 hours to cover a mile, about men the enemy would call ghosts. December 2006. General Petraeus publishes FM 3-24, Appendix A, written by an Australian. The key monograph supervised by an Australian Vietnam veteran. The doctrine Westmoreland dismissed as inactivity became the foundation for how America would fight wars in the 21st century. 40 years, 2 words, and not one apology. But Australians weren't waiting for one. Recognition came from the place where it carries weight, from the enemy. A former Viet Cong commander, I'm quoting, said, "The Australians were more patient than the Americans, better guerrilla fighters, better at ambushes. They liked to stay with us instead of calling in the planes. We were more afraid of their style." Their style, not their weapons, not their helicopters, not their bombs, not their budget, their style. 9 hours per mile, 30 rounds per contact, 12 hours of radio silence, 4 men in a team, 20 kilograms in a bunker, silence as doctrine.